Jerome Powell just told us when the Federal Reserve will be ending its quantitative tightening. Recently, Powell was speaking at the National Association for Business Economics in Philadelphia, and he said, "Our long-stated plan is to stop balance sheet runoff when reserves are somewhat above the level we judge consistent with ample reserve conditions." He went on to say, "We may approach that point in coming months." So what in the world is balance sheet runoff, quantitative tightening, QT, and how does it relate to QE or quantitative easing? Well, this is a chart of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. You can think of this like their brokerage account. It is their account that holds assets that they have purchased. This is different than a brokerage account for like you or I, where we have to put cash into that account first in order to be able to buy assets. The Federal Reserve just prints up the money that they need in order to buy any number of assets that they want. When this chart is moving higher, it means they are printing money and buying new assets that they're adding to their balance sheet. When this chart is moving lower, it means the total quantity of assets on their balance sheet is actually shrinking. Now, because the assets that they own are debt, they're either mortgage-backed securities or US Treasuries, it means that sometimes some of these bonds are getting paid off. Like they've got some T-bills and they've got some bonds from the US government. When those mature and the US government pays that debt back to the Federal Reserve, that bond ceases to exist. Also, that cash ceases to exist. Just like the Federal Reserve prints money to buy assets for their balance sheet, if anything gets paid back that they hold on their balance sheet, that cash also just ceases to exist. Now, as you see both in 2018, 2019, and then recently ever since 2022, the runoff in the balance sheet has been very smooth and consistent. This could not happen if they were just holding assets and then just waiting for some of them to get paid off. And so they determine what the speed of shrinking of their balance sheet will be, which means that sometimes they let some of these bonds get paid off. Sometimes they actually sell some of these bonds, so they sell them back out into the open market. The cash that gets paid to them for those assets gets destroyed, it ceases to exist. And then other times they actually still have to buy some assets, because if they do have too many bonds that all mature at the same time and their balance sheet would drop by too much, well, that would remove too much liquidity from the financial system. So they have to print up some extra money to buy some to replace those on their balance sheet. And that way, if you zoom in here, over just the last few years, you get this really smooth decline in their balance sheet. Now, I just mentioned that it adds or removes liquidity from the financial system when they're buying assets or letting assets bleed off their balance sheet. So how does that work? Well, think about your own brokerage account. Let's say you've funded your brokerage account with 100 grand worth of cash. You're sitting in there looking for something to buy. The moment you go out into the marketplace and you purchase something, whether it's shares of Amazon or you put it in some mutual fund, you have now injected liquidity into the financial system. You have taken your cash and you have handed it out to somebody else in the marketplace. In return, you got an asset. And so even though that is a very small example, it is still a real example. You are injecting liquidity into the financial system when you make purchases. Now, ultimately, this analogy breaks down because you had to get that cash from somewhere. When the Federal Reserve does this, they're creating that cash out of nothing, which means that when you consider the entire loop, the overall financial system from start to finish, from open to close, when they buy assets, they are injecting new money into the financial system that didn't exist before. So quantitative easing, when their balance sheet is rising, increases liquidity in the system. It increases the amount of cash reserves that are available for financial institutions to use and do other things with. The opposite is true as well. Over the last couple of years, ever since April of 2022, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has been declining outside of the spike when Silicon Valley Bank failed. This means that as those assets get retired, as that cash disappears, the liquidity in the system is getting drained. As that cash makes its way back to the Federal Reserve, it gets destroyed and it ceases to exist. That means of all of the liquidity that's available in the system, it is actually having a shrinking effect. Now, there are other factors that can overcompensate for this. So you can still have on net an increase in liquidity from things like bank lending increasing, but that doesn't change what the force is that the Federal Reserve is exerting on the financial system. So in summary, The Fed's balance sheet, when it is moving up, that means they're buying assets, and that is increasing liquidity in the system. When the balance sheet is moving down, that means they are selling assets or letting assets bleed off their balance sheet, and that is removing liquidity from the financial system. And obviously during times when it moves sideways, like it did from about 2014 through about 2017, as far as their balance sheet is concerned, they are not adding nor withdrawing liquidity from the system. So why is liquidity so important? Well, it's the lifeblood of financial institutions in a fiat world. It is the reason why banks started collapsing overnight in the great financial crisis, because they couldn't access the overnight cash that they needed, which meant the day opened up, they're done. They're bankrupt, they're closed, they're gone. And so if too much liquidity in the system dries up, you are at risk of banks not being able to get the overnight financing that they need and just collapsing. In fact, if you zoom in on the end of if you zoom in on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet to the end of 2019, this is exactly why the Federal Reserve started increasing their balance sheet again, even though they had been decreasing their balance sheet, because there were signs of a lack of liquidity in the system. Banks were potentially at risk of falling over, and so the Fed had to start injecting liquidity again. So what were those signs of a lack of liquidity? Well, this is the repo market. The repo market, repo stands for repurchase. This is where banks go to get that financing from each other, usually overnight. Banks will either have collateral or they'll have cash. If you're a bank that has cash, you are going to make a swap with another bank that has collateral. They're just going to promise they'll repurchase it from you at some point in the future. In September of 2019, all the liquidity in the system had been drained. All of the banks had collateral, but no cash. They all went to each other to try and get that cash. Nobody had it. So that interest rate for borrowing that overnight cash skyrocketed, and that's why the Fed intervened. In fact, during Powell's speech recently, he actually talked about this. He said that the committee's plans lay out a deliberately cautious approach to avoid the kind of money market strains that we experienced in September of 2019. This is what he was talking about, that when liquidity in the system got so low that the Fed had to intervene. So that's why this is all about liquidity, because you take a look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet and you see that it's been running off. The question is, when will liquidity in the system get too low, putting banks at risk of falling over overnight, prompting the Fed to have to do another round of not QE? Powell said they're aware of this risk, and they definitely don't want it to get to that point. Now, most people don't know this, but you can actually monitor the repo market yourself. The Federal Reserve publishes financial institutions' usage of the Fed's repo facility. So this is when financial institutions are trying to get cash from each other, but for whatever reason they can't, there's maybe not enough of it. They can actually now go to the Federal Reserve, because the Fed started their own repo facility, and banks can get the cash, the liquidity, that short-term cash that they need directly from the Fed. You can see obviously this spiked in 2019 when liquidity in the system was very, very low. This is when the Fed was intervening to make sure banks didn't fall over, like a repeat of the financial crisis. But you can also see towards the end of this chart, there have been spikes in usage of the Federal Reserve's repo facility again. And even though they are a lot lower than they were in September of 2019, you can see that there was no usage of this facility for years, but now it's starting to get used again. So the question is, why is it starting to get used now and it wasn't even getting touched for years? And stay with me here. That's where the Federal Reserve's reverse repo facility comes in. Now, this is a chart of the Federal Reserve's reverse repo facility. This is a facility they opened up to solve the exact opposite problem of a lack of liquidity. Sometimes in the financial system, there's too much liquidity. Now, the reason for this is because for a bank, a deposit is a liability. When you put cash into your bank account, you are the lender to the bank. So that deposit is your asset. It is the bank's liability. They owe you that money. They can't just hold on to it because they need to make a profit on that money. Otherwise, they're just holding on to your money, paying for all of those executive salaries, paying for all those buildings, and they're not doing anything with your money. So they're going to take it and they're going to go loan it out. They're going to do something with it in order to make some money, and they'll pay you 0.01% interest back to you as a thank you getting to use your money. Well, if we take a trip back in time about 5 years ago, the government had this fantastic idea to print trillions of dollars and increase the money supply by like 25% in 1 year. Biggest round of money printing we've seen in modern history. At the same time, the Federal Reserve, in order to create all that money for the government, they went out and they bought up all of the assets, all the US treasuries on the open market. So banks, as the government started to spend this money into the economy by handing out stimmy checks and things like that, banks started to get flooded with deposits. Well, for a bank, that deposit's a liability. So they've got to turn around and go buy an asset in order to offset that liability. But turns out the Federal Reserve had just bought up all those assets. And so they needed a place to park that excess liquidity, and they didn't have it. That's where the Federal Reserve's reverse repurchase facility comes in. This is an account where banks can park their cash at the Federal Reserve, get paid an interest rate, get collateral in the meantime that they need, and collect risk-free profit on your money. You can see this facility peaked at about $2.5 trillion worth in December of 2022. If that doesn't make any sense at all, it's an overflow account. When the financial system is flooded with too much cash for it to be able to handle without pushing interest rates negative, all of that cash then gets flooded over into this reverse repo facility, and it's just held at the Fed. You can see starting in about 2023, usage of this facility started to decline. As the Federal Reserve engaged in more and more tightening, the Fed was draining liquidity out of the financial system like we've been talking about. And now there is no more excess liquidity in the financial system anymore. If you zoom in on this chart just recently over the last couple of months, you can see that it is basically empty. It'll still have a little bit of usage here and there, but for practical purposes, there is no more excess liquidity in the financial system. And so the Federal Reserve bleeding down its balance sheet has done its job. It has drained the excess liquidity out of the financial system, as shown by the reverse repo facility going to basically zero, and as shown by the regular repo facility starting to see usage again. So that's why Powell said that their plan is to stop balance sheet runoff when reserves are somewhat above the level that they judge to be consistent with ample reserve conditions. Specifically, when he's talking about reserves there, he is talking about this, which is actual bank reserves, sitting right now around $3.2 trillion. Over the last couple of years, because there's been so much excess liquidity in the financial system and banks have been holding that in the reverse repo facility, the Federal Reserve has looked at those two things together. And they've said, hey, they are kind of fungible. They operate in the same way. Banks can access them in similar ways. So in terms of practical purposes for banks and judging liquidity in the financial system, we're going to say that real bank reserves and anything in the reverse repo facility also counts as bank reserves. Now that that reverse repo facility is down to zero, the only thing they're really looking at now is bank reserves, which is holding steady at around 3.2 trillion. This is a Goldilocks amount that the Federal Reserve wants to keep reserves at for now, judging anything that's in the reverse repo facility as excess, and then any increase or spikes in usage of the regular repo facility as signs of not enough, which is why he's talking about reserves here and saying that, yeah, now they're probably going to be stopping balance sheet runoff or ending QT, and it may happen in the next couple of months. Now, you'll notice on this chart of bank reserves that the bank reserves that banks held at the Federal Reserve didn't actually start until the financial crisis. Now, the reason for this is because after the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve was authorized to pay interest to banks on reserves that banks hold at the Fed. This is one of the ways that the Federal Reserve keeps a handle on overnight interest rates. It's how they make sure that the effective federal funds rate stays within the range that they want by paying interest on these overnight reserve balances. They were not able to do that prior to the financial crisis. So before that, the way that they maintained interest rates where they wanted them was through conducting market operations. In other words, they just go out and they'd buy and sell things like treasuries in order to dynamically and actively increase and reduce liquidity in the system, trying to exert those forces on the market to maintain interest rates where they wanted them. Now, if you've been following my channel for a while, you know that Congress has been considering getting rid of this, going back to the way the Fed used to do it, because if banks can't earn interest risk-free from the Fed themselves, banks are going to have to take that cash and turn and loan it to the US government instead, which means the US government could get a bunch of new lending a bunch of demand for treasuries that they don't have right now. During the speech, Powell was talking about this as well, saying that their ability to pay interest on overnight reserves is working well. He said this tool is what allows them to appropriately calibrate the stance of monetary policy. This isn't entirely true. It makes their job easier, but it's not required. Powell went on to say that if their ability to pay interest on overnight reserve balances was eliminated, then the Fed would lose control over interest rates. It's entirely possible that that is true. Maybe they don't have enough power with those old tools in order to exert enough force on interest rates now that the financial system is the way it is. But it's also possible that he just doesn't want to give it up. But lucky for the Federal Reserve, the US Senate last week just rejected this amendment that would have prohibited the Fed from paying interest on overnight reserve balances by a vote of 14 to 83. So it looks like the Federal Reserve wins this round. They're going to be able to keep all those reserve balances in order to more easily maintain interest rates where they want them, which means the US government is not going to get $3.5 trillion of new treasury demand, at least not anytime soon. That is unless, of course, the Fed needs to restart QE. And that is where their balance sheet starts to rise again. And of course, if you've been following me, then you know this as well, that is the only sustainable long-term solution for the government. Obviously, not good for the rest of us, but if the government wants all the demand that they need for their treasuries, for their giant appetite for borrowing, it's not going to come from gimmicks. It's not going to come from stable coins. It's not going to come from reducing interest or eliminating interest on reserve balances at the Fed. It's going to come from QE. It's going to come from printing. And so all roads lead there, which is why I think we're in for many years ahead of us of higher prices, higher inflation, higher interest rates, and higher asset prices. Because if everything's a bubble, nothing is. You just got to change your denominator. If you want more like this, especially want to hear me talk about stuff that I don't talk about on YouTube, I've got a free newsletter. So if you'd like to see me in your inbox every week, hit the link in the description below. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.